The English alphabet. We use it constantly. Our education essentially starts when we learn it. It's so foundational to our lives that we rarely stop to think where it came from. And yet, within the time span of written history, the modern English alphabet is a relative newcomer, but with an evolution dating back thousands of years. Today we're going to trace that evolution, from the hieroglyphs that recorded the history of the pharaohs to the 26 letters on your computer's keyboard. We'll talk about the mysterious Dark Age before the time of Christ that destroyed a unique Greek writing system, the conquest that made sure the letters you use look like this and not like this, and two battles that took place less than 3 weeks apart that completely changed the English language. This is the butterfly's wing, where we look at seemingly small things with unexpectedly large impacts. We know of two writing systems that existed in the late 4th millennium BC. The oldest was cuneiform, a Mesopotamian script developed by ancient Sumerians. The second was the Egyptian system of hieroglyphs. Both were originally composed entirely of logograms, characters that represented single words or concepts. But both systems later began to use some of their characters to spell out other words phonetically. Both also developed special characters called determinatives that helped readers determine when characters were being used phonetically and when they were being used as logograms. As we'll see throughout this video, the more than 4,000-year evolution from Egyptian hieroglyphs to our modern English alphabet was often marked by innovations of simplicity. One of the first such simplifications was the development of Heretic Script beginning in the late 4th millennium BC. Heretic Script was a simplified way of writing the older, more ornate hieroglyphs we're used to seeing carved onto Egyptian temples and monuments. While Hieratic never replaced the more familiar hieroglyphic writing, it was much faster and easier to write on scrolls made out of the papyrus plants that were plentiful in Egypt. So it became the most common way for Egyptians to write, until it was replaced by a later style, called Demotic. To make hieratic characters easier to write, they were drawn in a more abstract style than hieroglyphs. Whereas an artist might painstakingly carve a detailed hieroglyph of an owl onto a temple wall, a hieratic writer would simply draw a character that looked more like our modern 3, with the top curve meant to represent the owl's head and the lower curve meant to represent the owl's body. Hieratic Script set Egyptian writing on a separate path from cuneiform. Whereas a person writing cuneiform used a stylus to press an indentation into clay, a plentiful material in Mesopotamia, hieratic writers wrote their characters by applying ink to paper. And while hieratic writing doesn't look much like modern English writing, it certainly resembles English much more closely than does cuneiform, or hieroglyphs. The development of writing was a huge advantage for the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. It gave them the ability to create vast bureaucracies that could maintain records of agricultural surpluses, administer systems of taxation, and dictate how resources should be allocated. One of the main areas to which resources were allocated was toward the development and maintenance of large militaries. During the 2nd millennium BC, Egypt's military expansionism brought it into increased contact with people who spoke Semitic languages, sometimes hiring them as mercenaries to serve in the Egyptian military, and sometimes as opponents to be conquered. Both cases brought non-literate Semitic language speakers into contact with Egyptian writing. It was only natural they would adapt the system to record their own languages. But even the simplified hieratic script, with its hundreds of characters, was a remarkably complex system to try to learn and adapt. So Semitic speakers made another innovation of simplicity. They adapted hieratic to create just 24 symbols representing consonant sounds, ignoring all the other Egyptian characters, all the logograms, all the determinatives, and many phonetic characters. With these 24 symbols, letters, Semitic speakers created the first entirely phonetic writing system, the first true alphabet. We don't know exactly when or where during the 2nd millennium BC this alphabet was first used. One of the earliest examples may have been carved by Semitic-speaking mercenaries into a cliff face near the Nile, in the so-called Ravine of Terror. Other examples were found in a turquoise mine on the Sinai Peninsula that was worked by Semitic-speaking prisoners of war. Both inscriptions appear to reference Hathor, an Egyptian goddess associated with turquoise, who is thought to protect people in desert regions. By 1200 BC, the Greeks had already developed their own non-alphabetic writing system, Linear B, which by then had been in use for at least 250 years. But it was at this moment that the Mediterranean world entered a sudden, cataclysmic period. This so-called Bronze Age collapse was a period from approximately 1200 to 1150 BC, when nearly every large city in the eastern Mediterranean was abandoned. Contemporary writers wrote of invasions of mysterious sea people. Historians still debate what environmental, economic, and/or geopolitical events may have caused the collapse. During this Mediterranean Dark Age, the Greeks lost the use of their Linear B writing system forever, regressing back to a non-literate society. The Hittite Empire, centered in Anatolia, which used cuneiform writing, fell. Egypt persisted, but in a weakened state. The fall of the Hittite Empire and the decline of Egypt created a power vacuum in the Levant, a vacuum that came to be filled by new Semitic kingdoms that used versions of the Semitic alphabet. One of these versions was the Phoenician alphabet. The Phoenicians became a seafaring people who traded and established colonies throughout the Mediterranean. As they traveled, they spread their alphabet. One of the cultures that adopted and modified the Phoenician alphabet was that of the Greeks, who used the system to record the Greek language for the first time since the loss of Linear B. But the basic sounds used in Greek were quite different from those used in Semitic languages. Ancient Greek, much like modern English, placed much more importance on the use of vowel sounds than Semitic languages did. So when the Greeks adapted the Phoenician alphabet, they created new letters and took some Phoenician letters that made consonant sounds that weren't present in Greek and repurposed them to become the first written vowel letters. The Greeks also experimented with the orientation of their writing, at first writing from right to left as Egyptian and Phoenician writers did, then experimenting with so-called ox-turn writing, where the top line was written right to left, the second was written left to right, and each successive line alternated down the page. Ultimately, they adopted the left to right orientation we still use today. It's worth noting that during this period, Greeks were politically divided into different city-states, and these various city-states didn't adopt a uniform alphabet. Instead, they created Eastern, Southern, and Western versions. Users of the Western Greek alphabet colonized the Italian peninsula, where they introduced their alphabet to the Etruscans, and a tribe called the Latins, who would come to be known by the name of their capital city, Rome. The Latins, with Etruscan influences, modified the Western Greek alphabet to better suit their own language, much as the Greeks themselves had modified the Phoenician alphabet, eliminating some letters and repurposing others. The initial alphabet the Latins created is the same one we still use today, though it was missing 6 letters that were acquired later. But it would be centuries before the Latin alphabet, inspired by the Western Greek alphabet, would spread outside Italy. Instead, it would be the Eastern Greek alphabet that would see a meteoric rise first, thanks to its most famous user, Alexander the Great. In 330 BC, Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, then portions of India, ultimately establishing an empire that stretched from Greece to the Himalayas. We often portray Alexander's conquest as a showdown between East and West, but it was also a showdown between ancient writing systems, with the Eastern Greek alphabet ultimately displacing the cuneiform writing used in Persia and the hieroglyphic writing used in Egypt, which also became part of Alexander's Macedonian Empire. And while Alexander never banned these writing systems outright, and even had his own name written in hieroglyphs, his conquest ultimately consigned these older systems to the dustbin of history. In 323 BC, Alexander contracted a fever and died. It is said his last words were an answer to the question, "To whom do you leave your empire?" To which he responded, "To the strongest." The empire splintered. It's possible if the Macedonian Empire had remained intact, it, and with it the Eastern Greek alphabet, might have stood a better chance stopping Roman expansion nearly 2 centuries later. But this would not be the case. During the 3rd century BC, the Romans developed the letter G by modifying the letter C. Before G, C represented the sounds of both our modern C and G. A freed slave who opened a private elementary school is credited with inventing G, or at least being the first person to spread its use on a wide scale, around 230 BC. In 146 BC, the Romans sacked Corinth and took away Greek independence. Macedonia became a Roman province. That same year, the Romans destroyed Carthage, at the time the dominant power that still used a version of the Phoenician alphabet. The Roman conquest of Greece led to a greater cultural exchange between Greeks and Romans, including the introduction of many Greek loanwords into Latin. To accommodate the new Greek sounds that cropped up into Latin, the Romans added the letters Y and Z to their alphabet. The introduction of G, Y, and Z increased the Roman alphabet to its final 23 letters. After Rome's defeat of Carthage and conquest of Greece, the Republic continued to expand. In 55 BC, a Roman force under Julius Caesar crossed the English Channel, invading the island the Romans called Britannia. Despite multiple invasions, the Romans didn't conquer the bulk of present-day England until the Imperial era, in the 1st century AD. Roman occupation of Britain continued, at least nominally, until 410 AD. That same year, the city of Rome was sacked by the Visigoths. It might seem logical to think the forebearers of today's English speakers obtained alphabetic writing directly from the Romans during the occupation, but this was not the case. In the aftermath of the Roman evacuation of Britain, Germanic-speaking peoples from northern Europe, perhaps attracted to better farmland and the power vacuum left by the Romans, sailed to Britain. These people came to be known as Anglo-Saxons. They pushed local Celtic peoples to the northern and western edges of Great Britain and formed 7 main Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, with borders similar to modern-day England. The language these Anglo-Saxons came to speak is what we now call Old English. The alphabet these people initially used was not the Latin alphabet of the Romans, nor was it anything we would recognize as our own modern English alphabet. Instead, it was a Germanic runic alphabet called the Futhorc. We don't know exactly how runic writing developed on the continent, later to be taken by Anglo-Saxons to England, but it was most likely ultimately derived from the Western Greek alphabet, potentially through the Latin alphabet. Beginning around the 8th century, Irish came to Britain to spread Christianity to the Anglo-Saxons, who mainly practiced Germanic paganism. As these missionaries spread Christianity, they also reintroduced the Latin alphabet, ultimately leading to a variation called the Old English Latin alphabet, which replaced the Futhorc. The Old English Latin alphabet generally included 20 Latin letters, but usually excluded K, Q, and Z. In addition to the 20 Latin letters, this new English alphabet usually included 4 new letters that were either modified Latin letters or were held over from the runic alphabet to represent sounds that were common in Old English, but not in Latin. One of the greatest proponents of the Old English Latin alphabet was Alfred the Great, who in the 800s for the first time united the Anglo-Saxons into a single kingdom. Although he himself didn't learn to read until at least the age of 12, King Alfred, a committed Christian, sought to increase literacy amongst the Anglo-Saxon people, in part to promote religious study. Throughout the unified Anglo-Saxon period, the Anglo-Saxon people faced waves of raids and invasions by Vikings, Northern European peoples, who spoke Old Norse, a Germanic language related to the ancestral language of the Anglo-Saxons. At times, Norse invaders were even able to conquer England and sit on the English throne. Then, in 1066, the Anglo-Saxon King of England, Edward the Confessor, died childless. 3 claimants sought to succeed him, each from a different linguistic tradition. Harold Godwinson, King Edward's brother-in-law, was an Anglo-Saxon nobleman who spoke Old English. Harold Hardrada, the King of Norway, whose claim to the English throne relied on an earlier Viking conquest, spoke Old Norse. William, Duke of Normandy, spoke Old Norman French, an early version of French with Germanic influences that came from Viking Northmen who settled in Normandy. The day after Edward the Confessor died, Harold Godwinson had himself crowned King of England. He then took a force north to counter invasion by Harold Hardrada, defeating Hardrada at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Godwinson then hurried south to counter invasion by William of Normandy. On October 14, 1066, at the Battle of Hastings, William defeated and killed Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England. Today we call him William, the Conqueror. The events of 1066 are in many ways a microcosm of the tremendous linguistic changes that happened to English between the 5th and 11th centuries. During this time, Anglo-Saxon speakers of Old English, Old Norse speakers, and speakers of Old Norman French all mixed. Their languages mixed as well, causing early forms of Old English to evolve and eventually to develop into the Middle English that came to be spoken after the Norman conquest. And as the English language evolved, the English alphabet evolved with it. Because it was too often confused with P, the runic letter Win was replaced with our modern W, which is why William the Conqueror's name is spelled William and not William. U was invented to distinguish the U sound from the V sound, which were originally both represented by the V. French and Latin influences led K, Q, and Z to be added to the English alphabet. The letters Ash, F, and Thorn disappeared from use, in part because when the printing press was invented in Germany, German printers did not use these letters. The final letter to be added was J, the sound of which was originally represented by I. After the Norman conquest, French loanwords incorporated the J sound into English much more frequently. With this final addition, we arrive at the 26 letters of our modern English alphabet. It's worth noting that the English alphabet is an invention that was crowdsourced over thousands of years by a remarkably diverse group of people, the vast majority of whom we wouldn't think of as remotely English. Not surprisingly, like many inventions, its evolution was often spurred on by dramatic change, great military triumphs, and cataclysmic collapse, but also by seemingly modest innovations, by seemingly modest people, slaves and scribes, who simply wanted to make their lives a little better. We often think of innovation as something very recent, perhaps really only beginning with the invention of the transistor, not even a century ago, but I think it goes back much further. Thanks for watching. Egyptian hieroglyphs, a writing system that may have been inspired by cuneiform, also used determinatives, such as the cartouche, a symbol drawn around hieroglyphs to indicate that those hieroglyphs phonetically spelled out a royal person's name. The end result of these innovations was a highly complex but workable writing system for an elite group of specially trained scribes, perhaps no more than 1% of the total population. Scholars don't agree.